air in the booth was a battlefield. The aggressive grease of the diner clashed with the rich, woody precision of Valerie's sandalwood perfume. She sat across from me, looking dangerously out of place in her Italian wool suit against the chipped formica. We had a rule called distance, a treaty to keep us professional to survive this merger. But my hands weren't trembling from the caffeine. They shook because the distance had shrunk to the width of a table, and the proximity to the woman I'd spent 5 years trying to dismantle was suffocating. We were the architects of this city's corporate warfare, mercenaries hired when the stakes became too high for standard diplomacy. I represented the agile, aggressive tech startup. Valerie represented the monolithic conglomerate trying to swallow us whole. For 6 months, we had been the faces of a hostile takeover that had bled into the financial headlines. But our history stretched back much further than this merger. For 5 years, I had watched her across the aisle of various courtrooms. I knew the exact cadence of her voice when she was cornering a witness, a low, melodic trap that snapped shut before they even realized they were caught. Her cross-examinations never felt like public performances to me. They felt like private conversations, displays of intellect sharpened and directed solely at my throat. To the gallery, it was legal maneuvering. To me, it was a dance. I knew she wore that specific shade of navy when she was going for the kill. I knew she tapped her pen twice when she was bluffing. We had spent years mapping each other's minds, learning the topography of each other's intellects better than we knew our own friends. It was an intimacy born of conflict, a closeness forged in the fire of opposition. This morning was supposed to be the endgame. A neutral ground breakfast to finalize the settlement terms before the trial began on Monday. The location was my idea, a strategic error I was currently regretting. The boardrooms we usually inhabited were too cold, too controlled, too full of a silence that stretched like a wire, ready to snap. I had thought I needed noise. I thought the clatter of silverware and the murmur of other people's mundane lives would drown out the frequency that hummed between us. But the diner was a mistake. Here, stripped of the heavy mahogany tables and the army of paralegals, there was nowhere to hide. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. It takes a specific kind of stamina to maintain hatred when the underlying emotion is actually a heavy, unacknowledged reverence. I was tired. I was tired of the posturing, tired of the sharp suits that felt like armor, tired of pretending that her presence didn't alter the atmospheric pressure of the room. I looked at her, really looked at her, studying the way her dark hair fell against the collar of her suit. She was reading the settlement draft, her eyes scanning the text with that terrifying focus I had learned to fear and crave. She wasn't just my rival. She was the only person who understood the language I spoke. The isolation of competence is a lonely place, and for half a decade, she had been the only other inhabitant.
Clause 4B is unacceptable, she said, not looking up.
Her voice was steady, devoid of the morning's grogginess. You're trying to leverage the IP portfolio against the liquidity assets. It's a transparent move.
It's a standard move, I countered, my voice sounding rougher than hers. And you know the liquidity is smoke and mirrors. I need hard assets. She finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently filled with a challenge that had nothing to do with intellectual property.
You always want the tangible, don't you? She asked. The question hung there, weighted with double meaning. In the courtroom, I fought for facts. In this booth, I was fighting the urge to reach out and touch the fabric of her sleeve, just to verify she was real. The mask was slipping. I could feel the edges of my professional persona fraying under the intensity of her gaze.
We were supposed to be discussing millions of dollars in assets, but the conversation felt like a cover for something far more volatile. The vinyl squeaked as I shifted, a cheap sound contrasting the courthouse hush. The smell of frying bacon was cloying, too sweet for the bitterness of the negotiation. I felt exposed here. The air between us thickened, charged with the static of everything we hadn't said for 5 years. I watched her hand tighten slightly around her pen, a small betrayal of her own composure. We were two magnets forced together, the resistance building until it felt like a physical ache in my chest. I opened my mouth to defend Clause 4B, but the words died in my throat. Just as the silence threatened to turn into something irreversible, a shadow fell over the table. The waitress stood there, pot raised, shattering the moment. The waitress retreated, leaving a pot of black coffee and a vacuum of silence that felt smaller than before. In this red vinyl cave, the geography was treacherous. My knee hovered exactly 2 inches from hers. If I relaxed my posture for even a second, gravity would win. My leg would drift that final, fatal inch, and the contact would be catastrophic. It would be an admission. Valerie didn't seem to notice. She picked up her pen, the gold cap catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Let's discuss the non-compete radius," she said. Her voice was low, that steady, unflinching contralto that usually commanded a courtroom. Here, stripped of the acoustics, it felt different. It vibrated in the small space between us, a frequency tuned specifically to my hearing. "My client wants 5 years, 50 miles. 5 years is a lifetime," I replied, forcing my eyes to stay on the paper and not the hollow of her throat. "You're asking for total submission." "I'm asking for security," she corrected, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying precision. "Submission implies you have no choice. Security implies I'm making sure you don't run." "I don't run," I said, my voice dropping. "I reposition." "Then reposition this." She slid a document across the table. I looked down, trying to focus on the text rather than the movement of her fingers. Long, elegant, capable of tearing a precedent apart or signing a treaty. I wondered, against my better judgment, what those hands felt like when they weren't wielding a pen as a weapon. The thought was a betrayal. I pushed it down, burying it under case law. "You're citing Harrison v. Tech Corp," I said, reading the text upside down. "It's bold. It's also irrelevant if we structure the acquisition as a merger of equals." "It becomes relevant if you try to divest the software division," she countered immediately, not missing a beat. "Which you will, because you think the hardware is the liability." "The hardware is the liability," I shot back. "It's dead weight. If we cut it, we lose the patent portfolio attached to the manufacturing process," she finished for me. We stopped. It was terrifying. We weren't arguing anymore. We were building the same structure. We were finishing each other's legal theories with a fluidity that shouldn't exist between enemies. It was a display of compatibility that was far more dangerous than the animosity. We spoke the exact same language. She just knew. She saw the architecture of the deal before I even laid the foundation. The air in the booth thickened, pressurized by the realization. The only thing that was real was the woman across from me and the dangerous proximity of our knees. I shifted again, the vinyl squeaking in protest. Valerie glanced down, just for a second, toward the space under the table. Then her eyes snapped back to mine. She knew. She felt the heat, too. "If we keep the hardware," I said, my voice softer now, "we need to restructure the debt." "I've already drafted a debt equity swap," she said. "It's in the addendum, page 42. "You're too good at this," I murmured, the mask slipping. "I have to be," she replied, her expression softening. "Look who I'm up against." The compliment landed like a physical blow.
a direct hit to the chest. A stack of buttermilk pancakes sat between us, topped with a hedonistic amount of whipped cream. The scent of warm maple syrup and melted butter rose up, a cloying domestic sweetness that had no business existing in the high-stakes atmosphere. It was an olfactory breach of contract. We were here to discuss asset liquidation, not comfort food. I watched, mesmerized, as Valerie picked up her fork. Seeing her prepare to eat was like watching a statue breathe. She poured the syrup with the same deliberate, calculated grace she used to pour evidence into the record. A steady, golden stream that coated the stack without spilling a single drop onto the chipped table. She cut a piece, the metal knife clicking against the ceramic plate, the sound sharp and rhythmic. She took a bite. The act rendered her unexpectedly, terrifyingly human. The realization chipped away at the armor I wore, leaving my own defenses perilously thin. She chewed slowly, her eyes never leaving the document in front of her, but the tension in her jaw had softened. "You're not eating," she observed, not looking up from the debt equity swap. Her voice was casual, but I knew better. Nothing with Valerie was ever truly casual. "I don't eat before a settlement," I replied, my hand tightening around my coffee mug. "Digestion slows the reflexes." "That's a myth," she said, finally lifting her gaze. She pointed her fork at me, a gesture that should have been aggressive but felt strangely playful. "You don't eat because you run on anxiety and black coffee. It's not sustainable." "It's effective," I countered. "It's exhausting," she corrected. She set the fork down, the humor vanishing from her eyes, replaced by a scrutiny that felt heavier than any cross-examination. She leaned forward slightly, encroaching on the neutral zone over the table. "You look tired." The words landed softly, but they hit with the force of a verdict. It wasn't an insult. In the courtroom, "You look tired" is a weapon, a way to signal weakness to the jury. Here, in the quiet hum of the booth, it sounded dangerously like recognition. It was a mirror she was holding up, forcing me to see the dark circles I'd concealed with concealer, the tremor in my hands I'd blamed on the caffeine. "This case," I said, the excuse tasting like ash in my mouth. "The timeline is impossible. The due diligence alone is a nightmare." "It's not the case," she said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register that always made the air feel too thin. "It's the fight. It wears you down." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because she was right, but she was missing the crucial variable. It wasn't just the fight that kept me awake at 3 a.m. It was her. It was the mental chess match I played against her ceiling every night. The way my brain insisted on replaying her closing arguments on a loop. It was the exhaustion of maintaining a mask of indifference when every interaction with her set my nerves on fire. I was tired of pretending that I didn't admire the way her mind worked, tired of suppressing the urge to ask her what she did when the suit came off. The noise of the diner, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of the couple in the next booth, began to fade. The world narrowed down to the few feet of space between us. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim, focusing the entirety of the universe onto the woman across from me. The air charged, thick and heavy, vibrating with the truth I was refusing to speak. "We're almost done," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about the contract or us. "Are we?" she asked. She picked up her fork again, eyes locking onto mine, holding me pinned in the booth. She sliced another piece of the pancake, ensuring it was laden with the white, airy cream. It was a deliberate, slow movement. She brought the fork to her lips, the action magnified in the silence between us. It happened in the space between a heartbeat and a breath. She lowered the fork, the metal clinking softly against the ceramic. And there it was, a small, stark smudge of white whipped cream clung to the corner of her upper lip. It was a tiny imperfection, a trivial accident of physics and dairy. But on her, it looked like a catastrophe. It was a glitch in the matrix of her terrifying perfection, a crack in the marble facade she had spent 5 years polishing. I should have looked away. I should have politely pointed to my own lip, the universal signal for, you have something on your face. I should have handed her a napkin. That's what a colleague would do. That's what a rival would do, maybe even smirk about it, tucking the knowledge away as a petty victory. But I didn't do any of those things. I just stared. The words liability clause died in my throat, replaced by a sudden, jagged dryness that made speaking impossible. The diner ceased to exist. The waitress refilling coffees 3 booths down, the clatter of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator, it all fell away into a muted gray background. The only thing in focus, the only thing in color, was that smudge of white against the flushed skin of her mouth. I stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence that followed wasn't the thoughtful pause of a negotiation. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a bomb scare. It was the sound of a rule being bent until it screamed. Valerie blinked. She sensed the shift immediately. She was too sharp not to. But she misread the source. She thought I had found a hole in her contract, not a flaw in her composure. "Is it the indemnity?" she asked, her voice tight, ready to defend her ground. She leaned in slightly, her brow furrowing. "Because if you think we're going to absorb the third-party risk, you're delusional." She was talking about risk. She had no idea. I didn't answer. I couldn't have formed a coherent legal argument if my life depended on it. My entire consciousness had funneled down into a single, overwhelming impulse. It wasn't a decision. Decisions imply logic, a weighing of pros and cons. This was gravity. This was the inevitable collapse of a structure that had been built on 5 years of repression. My hand lifted from the table. I watched it move as if it were a separate entity, disconnected from my brain. It hovered over the red-line draft of the settlement, casting a shadow over the carefully negotiated terms. It moved through the steam rising from the coffee cups, crossing the invisible, demilitarized zone we had so carefully patrolled. 5 years of keeping my distance, of staying on my side of the aisle, of never letting the personal bleed into the professional. All of it evaporated in the span of 2 seconds. Valerie's eyes tracked the movement. She didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. She went unnaturally still, her breath catching in a way that I felt rather than heard. She watched my hand approach her face with the same wide-eyed, paralyzed intensity of a deer watching headlights. She didn't know what I was doing, but she wasn't stopping me. My thumb made contact. The sensation was a shock to the system, a jolt of pure sensory data that overrode everything else. I expected her to be cool. She always looked so cool, so untouched by the friction of the world. But she was warm. Radiantly, shockingly warm. The heat of her skin burned against the pad of my thumb, a stark contrast to the cool, airy texture of the cream. I brushed it away. A single, deliberate sweep. The skin at the corner of her mouth was impossibly soft. It was a texture I had no right to know, a secret I had just stolen. I felt the tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in her lip as I touched her. It was a betrayal of her body against her mind, a physical admission that she was just as affected as I was. I should have pulled back then. The cream was gone. The gesture could have been played off, a moment of odd, intrusive politeness. There, I fixed it. But I didn't pull back. I couldn't. My hand lingered, my thumb resting just a millimeter from the corner of her mouth, my fingers hovering near her jawline. I was cupping the air around her face, holding the space, refusing to retreat. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they swallowed the iris, I saw myself reflected in them, a woman who had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The distance wasn't just breached, it was obliterated. The contract on the table was now just paper. The real negotiation had just begun, and it was happening entirely in the heat, radiating between her skin and my hand. We were suspended there, in the terrified, electric quiet of a touch that had lasted 3 seconds too long to be anything but a confession. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was solid. It filled the booth, pressing against the rain-streaked windows, displacing the oxygen we needed to breathe. My thumb was still hovering, a satellite caught in her gravity, suspended in the charged air between us. In a courtroom, 5 seconds of silence is a calculated tactic, a weapon used to unsettle a witness. Here, it was a confession. Valerie didn't move. She didn't recoil in shock or pull back in professional indignation. She just breathed. A shallow, shaky intake of air that brushed warm against my fingertips. Her eyes, usually razor-sharp and guarded, were wide open, the pupils expanding until the dark brown iris was barely visible. In her place was a woman who looked stunned. Not by the audacity of the touch, but by the terrifying welcome of it. I finally pulled my hand back. It required a physical effort, like wading through deep water. The distance between us returned, physically at least, but the breakthrough was done. My skin tingled where I had touched her, a phantom pressure that felt more real than the formica table under my elbows. I curled my fingers into a tight fist in my lap, trying to preserve the sensation, trying to hide the tremor that had returned with a vengeance. Valerie cleared her throat. The sound was rough, unpolished. She looked down at the settlement papers, her gaze unfocused, staring at the paragraphs as if they were written in a language she had forgotten how to read. The timeline, she said. Her voice lacked its usual resonance. It was thin, breathless. We were discussing the timeline for the asset transfer. Right, I managed to reply, my own voice sounding foreign. The timeline. The words sounded absurd. We were sitting there, pretending to care about fiscal quarters and regulatory approval, while the air around us was still vibrating from the heat of that touch. The legal terminology felt hollow, like reciting nursery rhymes at a funeral. I looked at the clause she was pointing to, but the letters swam before my eyes. I think, she started, then stopped. She reached for her water glass, her hand shaking just enough to make the ice cubes chime softly against the glass. I think the 48-hour window is standard. It is, I agreed, staring at her mouth. It's standard. We were agreeing. We were nodding. We were terrified. The diner suddenly felt oppressive. The smell of the maple syrup turned cloying, suffocating. The heat radiating from the radiator under the window, or maybe from her legs near mine, made the air too thin to breathe. I felt dizzy, lightheaded with the sudden shift in gravity. The noise of the diner rushed back in, but it was distorted, a cacophony of clattering plates and voices that felt miles away. The only thing that mattered was the flush rising on Valerie's neck, the way she was biting her lower lip, the same spot I had just touched. She couldn't handle it. I saw the moment her composure finally cracked. She couldn't sit in this booth, in this radiant heat, pretending that nothing had changed. She abruptly raised her hand, signaling the waitress with a frantic urgency that was entirely unlike her. "Check!" she called out, her voice slightly too loud. "We're done here." She started gathering her papers, shoving the carefully drafted settlement into her leather briefcase with clumsy, chaotic movements. Papers crinkled. The pristine organization she prided herself on was abandoned. She was fleeing. She was retreating from the negotiation, not because she was losing the deal, but because she was in danger of losing control.
And for the first time in 5 years, I didn't want to stop her. I needed the air too. We stepped out of the diner and into a wall of gray. The transition was violent, a physical shock to the system that left us breathless. 1 second, we were encased in the cloying, golden warmth of maple syrup and diner grease. The next, we were assaulted by the sharp, metallic bite of a November drizzle. The rain wasn't heavy, but it was cold, a relentless mist that instantly clung to our hair and dampened the expensive wool of our suits. It should have been a relief. The cold air should have cooled the flush that was still burning on my neck and settled the erratic, thumping rhythm of my heart. Instead, the contrast only made the heat inside me burn hotter. It sealed us in. The world outside the diner was washed out, a watercolor painting left out in the storm, blurring the edges of the parking lot and erasing the rest of the city. We walked in silence toward the back of the lot, our heels clicking in a jagged, unsynchronized rhythm on the wet asphalt. Of course, we were parked next to each other. It was a final, cosmic joke. Or perhaps a subconscious coordination we hadn't even noticed when we arrived. Her sleek, silver German sedan sat beside my dark coupe. 2 machines built for speed and control, now sitting idle and wet in the rain. The lot was otherwise empty, a vast expanse of gray pavement reflecting the slate sky. There were no witnesses here. No juries to sway, no waitresses to interrupt, no paralegals to take notes. Just the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roofs of our cars and the suffocating weight of everything we hadn't said inside. We stopped between the vehicles, standing in the narrow channel of space that separated her life from mine. This was the moment. The script required us to shake hands, firmly, professionally, and mutter something about seeing each other in court on Monday. I should have unlocked my car. She should have opened hers. We should have retreated to the safety of our separate, hermetically sealed environments where the rules of engagement were clear. But neither of us moved. We stood there, the rain darkening the shoulders of our jackets, ruining the fabric we paid a fortune to keep pristine. I watched a droplet of water trace a path down her cheek, mimicking the path my thumb had taken moments ago. The air between us was heavy, charged with the static of the storm and the lingering electricity of the booth. Valerie shifted, her composure finally fracturing under the weight of the silence. She reached into her bag for her keys, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. A stark, jarring departure from the fluid grace she always displayed in the courtroom. Her fingers fumbled against the leather. The keys slipped from her grasp. They hit the wet asphalt with a sharp, metallic clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. It was instinct. We both moved at the same time. I dropped into a crouch just as she bent down, and suddenly, the world shrank to a terrifyingly intimate radius. We weren't just hands across a table anymore. We were bodies in space, occupying the same small pocket of air. My shoulder brushed against hers, wet wool against wet wool, and the friction sent a shockwave through my entire nervous system. I reached for the keys, but her hand was already there. My fingers landed on top of hers, covering them against the cold, wet metal. We froze. Crouched there on the wet pavement, the rain plastering our hair to our foreheads, we looked at each other. The distance was gone. I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, usually hidden by the courtroom distance. I could smell the rain mixing with her sandalwood perfume, creating a scent that was earthy, raw, and intoxicating. Her breath hitched, a small cloud of condensation ghosting against my lips. We were close enough to kiss. The thought wasn't an intrusion this time. It was an inevitability. It was the logical conclusion to 5 years of arguments. We stood up slowly, rising together as if connected by a string. I didn't let go of her hand. I held the keys, and by extension, I held her. We were standing in the narrow channel between our cars, trapped by metal and rain. The water ran down her face, stripping away the last of the lawyer, leaving only the woman. She looked at me, her expression raw, stripped of all the defenses she wore like armor. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the rain, but it cut through me like a knife. It wasn't a command, it was a plea. It was a surrender. I tightened my grip on her hand, the keys biting into my palm. I knew exactly what she meant. We couldn't keep pretending. We couldn't keep fighting a war when we both wanted to surrender to the same side. But I needed her to say it. I needed the verdict on the record. "Doing what?" I asked, my voice low, challenging her to verbalize the thing we had been dancing around since the moment we met. She didn't back down. The challenge sparked something in her eyes, that familiar fire I had seen 1,000 times during cross-examination. But this time, the fire wasn't aimed at destroying my argument. It was aimed at me. She took a step forward, closing the final inch of space. The movement forced me back until my hips hit the cold, wet metal of her car. She had me pinned. There was nowhere to go, no objection to raise. She looked up at me, rain dripping from her lashes, and for the first time, the rivalry wasn't a wall between us. It was a bridge. Her hand didn't retreat. Instead, it moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, sliding from the cold, wet metal of the car door to the curve of my waist. It was a heavy, grounding weight, a claim staked in the middle of a torrential downpour. The wool of my coat was damp, heavy with the morning's gray misery, but the heat of her palm seared through the layers, branding me right there in the empty lot. This wasn't the tentative, accidental touch of the diner. This was possession. The rain drummed a frantic, chaotic rhythm against the roof of the sedan, a percussion that matched the hammering of my heart. But between us, the air went still. She stepped closer, invading the last sanctuary of personal space I had left, until I could feel the rise and fall of her chest against mine, the friction of our coats creating a zone of static heat. "We can't keep fighting," she whispered. The words were ghosted against my jawline, hot and damp, carrying the scent of coffee and the rain. "I'm exhausted, and it's not the case law. It's not the merger." "I know," I breathed back, my hands finding purchase on the lapels of her jacket, holding on as if the wet asphalt beneath us had turned to glass. "We've spent 5 years trying to destroy each other. 5 years of wasted energy." "And for what?" she asked, her eyes searching mine, dark and unguarded, the pupils blown wide despite the daylight. "To prove we're the smartest people in the room? I don't care about the room anymore. I just care that you're in it." The admission hung there, suspended in the mist, heavier than the humidity. It was a surrender of assets far more valuable than any tech merger or patent portfolio. She was liquidating her pride, offering up her vulnerability as collateral in a deal I hadn't realized we were making. "I made the rule," I confessed, the truth tearing its way out of my throat, raw and unpolished. The distance. It wasn't about professional ethics. It was a containment strategy. She tilted her head, a single raindrop catching on her lashes like a diamond, before tracing the line of her cheek. "Containment of what?" "Of this," I said, my voice breaking on the syllable. "Of the fact that every time you walked into a courtroom, I forgot which side I was supposed to be on. I knew if I got too close, if I let the distance close, I would crumble. I built walls of precedent and statutes to keep you out, not because I hated you, but because I knew the chemistry was volatile. I can't win against you when I want you to win. Valerie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. A release of tension that vibrated through her chest and into mine. Her hand tightened on my waist, pulling me imperceptibly closer, though I didn't think it was possible. Her palm was a solid, unyielding weight against my side, grounding me in the chaos of the storm. "You think you're the only one?" she murmured, her voice dropping to that low, steady register that usually commanded silence, but now commanded only my heartbeat. "Why do you think I agreed to this diner? To this god-forsaken location with its terrible coffee and fluorescent lights?" "Because it was neutral ground," I stammered, clinging to the old logic like a lifeline. "There is no neutral ground with us," she corrected, her thumb tracing the line of my hip bone through the wet wool, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm. "I agreed because I wanted to see you before the armor went on. I wanted to see you in the morning light, unpolished, real. I wanted to know if you drank coffee with sugar, or if you were as bitter as you pretend to be." "And?" I asked, the word barely a whisper, lost in the sound of the rain. "And you're sweeter," she said. "And you're terrified. And you have cream on your lip that I wanted to wipe away myself." The reference to the diner moment sent a fresh wave of heat through me. The smell of the rain, metallic, ozone, wet pavement, mixed with the rich, woody scent of her sandalwood perfume. It was an intoxicating blend, the scent of a storm breaking, the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The world outside this narrow channel between the cars had ceased to exist. There were no clients, no judges, no billable hours. There was only the rain, the cold metal against my back, and the woman who had been my enemy for 5 years, now looking at me like I was the only verdict that mattered. "So the rule is gone?" she asked, her gaze dropping to my mouth, heavy with intent. "The rule is void," I confirmed. "Breach of contract." "Good," she breathed, her face inches from mine. "Because I'm about to violate several codes of professional conduct." She leaned in, and the decision was made. The fighting was over. The years of sharp words and sharper glances were just the prelude to this silence. The war ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, heavy slide of bodies finally aligning in the rain, acknowledging that the rivalry was just a cover for a hunger we could no longer deny. The kiss, when it finally bridged the gap, wasn't a movie moment. It wasn't a soft, tentative exploration of new territory, or a gentle question asked in the rain. It was a collision. It was the violent, inevitable impact of two high-speed trains that had been racing toward each other on the same track for half a decade. It was the sum total of 5 years of sidebar arguments, of late-night email wars, of adrenaline spikes in silent elevators. All that kinetic energy, all that sharpened intellect and professional frustration finally found its target. Valerie kissed with the same terrifying precision she used to dismantle a hostile witness. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. She simply claimed the jurisdiction she had been eyeing for years. Her mouth was hot, demanding, and unflinching, a stark contrast to the freezing rain that was now soaking through my coat. I tasted the bitter remnants of the diner coffee on her tongue, mixed with the metallic tang of the rain and the overwhelming flavor of intent. It was a kiss that held the weight of everything we had swallowed, every biting remark, every cold shoulder, every moment of jealousy disguised as professional disdain. I made a sound, something low and wrecked, and abandoned the last shred of my composure. My hands, which had been gripping the car keys like a lifeline, finally let go. The keys clattered to the pavement, unnoticed and irrelevant. I reached up, my fingers tangling into the damp, dark silk of her hair. I ruined the perfect, severe bun she wore to intimidate judges. I pulled the pins free, feeling the heavy mass of her hair tumble down over my cold fingers, a chaotic cascade that softened the sharp angles of her face. I needed to feel the reality of her, the messiness of her, stripped of the lacquer and the control. She responded by escalating the claim. Her hand, which had been resting on my waist, slid down with a deliberate, heavy friction. It moved over the wet wool of my hip and settled firmly on my thigh. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was a grip. She squeezed, her fingers digging in through the layers of fabric, grounding me against the car, claiming the space with an authority that made my knees weak. It was a possessive, electric contact that sent a jolt straight to my core, bypassing my brain entirely. In that rain-soaked parking lot, with the gray sky pressing down on us, the rivalry didn't just dissolve, it transmuted. I realized, with a clarity that was blinding, that the energy we had been using to fight each other was the same energy we were now using to consume each other. The aggression, the obsession, the constant need to best the other person, it was all just this warmth, inverted. We hadn't been enemies. We had been partners in a dance so aggressive, neither of us recognized the music. Until now, I pressed closer, eliminating the last millimeter of air between our bodies. The cold metal of the car door bit into my back, but the heat radiating from Valerie was a furnace. I felt the frantic hammering of her heart against my own chest, a synchronized rhythm that beat out a new contract. She tilted her head, deepening the kiss, drinking me in like I was the only oxygen left in the atmosphere. I met her everywhere, matching her intensity, proving that I could navigate this terrain just as skillfully as I navigated a merger. We broke apart only when the need for air became a biological imperative. We didn't go far. Our foreheads rested against each other, wet skin against wet skin, forming a new, private atmosphere. I was gasping, my breath coming in ragged, white clouds that mingled with hers. The rain was still falling, plastering my shirt to my skin, running in cold rivulets down my neck, but I barely registered the temperature. I was burning up from the inside out. Valerie's eyes were closed, her long lashes wet and dark against her flushed cheeks. Her hands still held me, one on my waist, one on my thigh, refusing to relinquish custody. I looked at her, this brilliant, formidable woman who had terrified me for years, and saw the vulnerability she had hidden behind the motions to dismiss. The merger would happen. The papers would be signed, the assets would be transferred. But as I stood there, trembling in her arms, I knew the most significant acquisition of my career had just taken place. The rain began to slow, the torrential downpour fading into a soft, quiet drizzle, leaving us standing in the charged, silent aftermath of the breakthrough. "You're freezing," she said, the practical lawyer re-emerging through the haze. She unlocked her car, the lights flashing a soft welcome. We slid into the front seats, the heavy doors thumping shut to seal us in a capsule of quiet leather and dry heat. The silence here was different than the diner. It wasn't pressurized. It was protective. The engine wasn't running, but the atmosphere was humming. I watched her hands, those capable, dangerous hands that had just been in my hair, grip the steering wheel. She wasn't driving. She was anchoring herself. "So," I started, my voice sounding rough in the sudden quiet. I wiped water from my eyes, conscious of how ruined my makeup must be. "The merger goes through?" "The merger goes through," she confirmed. She turned in her seat to face me, ignoring the water dripping from her coat onto the pristine upholstery. The wet strands of her hair were plastered to her neck, ruining the Italian wool, and she had never looked more beautiful. "But the terms of engagement have changed." I think we need to renegotiate the interpersonal clauses. Drastically, I agreed, leaning back against the headrest. The adrenaline was settling into a warm, humming contentment that felt heavier than exhaustion. I think we violated the distance clause. I shredded the distance clause, she corrected. A small, crooked smile broke the severity of her face. A smile I'd never seen in court, reserved, I realized, for this specific, private proximity. But don't think this makes me soft. I still want to win. You think this is a concession? I challenged, turning to mirror her position. The space between the seats was the only barrier left, and it felt negligible. We can both win, Valerie. That's the nature of a partnership. Unless you're afraid you can't keep up without the antagonism. Partnership. She tested the word, rolling it around her mouth like a fine wine she wasn't sure she should swallow. Her eyes dropped to my lips again, dark and contemplative. I suppose I can draft an addendum for that. But be warned, I'm aggressive in negotiations. I know, I murmured. I've seen your briefs. She reached out then. The movement was slow, deliberate, telegraphing her intent. Her thumb brushed against my cheekbone, catching a stray drop of rain that had escaped my earlier attempts to dry off. It was a perfect, cinematic mirror of the diner moment. But the context had inverted. There was no shock this time, only a deep, resounding claim. She wasn't wiping away a mistake or a smudge of cream. She was acknowledging ownership. The heat of her skin against my cold face was a promise. The texture of her thumb rough against the softness of my cheek. She lingered there, her palm cupping my jaw, holding my gaze with an intensity that stripped me bare. Tonight, she said, her voice dropping to that register that made my toes curl inside my wet shoes. No neutral ground. No diners with fluorescent lights. No contracts. My place, I offered, the invitation hanging between us like a physical weight. I make better coffee than the diner, and I promise not to cite case law before dessert. I'll hold you to that, she whispered, her thumb tracing the line of my lower lip. 7 p.m. Don't be late. I'm never late, I reminded her, leaning into her touch just for a second before pulling back. I'm just strategic, she laughed, a genuine, throaty sound that seemed to brighten the gray interior of the car. We exited the vehicle reluctantly, the cold air hitting us again, but the chill couldn't touch the warmth she'd ignited. I walked to my car, feeling her eyes on my back, a weight I used to dread, but now carried like a trophy. I sat in my driver's seat, gripping the wheel, and watched her silver sedan pull away. As her taillights faded into the mist, a profound sense of relief washed over me. The weight of the distance was gone, replaced by the thrill of the unknown. I knew, with a certainty that defied all legal precedent, that she would return. I looked over at the passenger seat. The signed settlement agreement sat there, crisp and white. An hour ago, it was the most important document in my life. Now, it was irrelevant paper compared to the shift in my reality. The distance was officially closed. The professional boundary had been crossed and erased. If you've ever found clarity in the heat of a moment you tried to avoid, subscribe for more stories. The rivalry is over. The real pleasure begins now.